Good evening. Whoa! We are going to try and start promptly at 7 so we can get out of here. If I could have the talkers sit in the front row, please, pretty please.
It works. Welcome. I'm Dana Connell, and along with my wife Laura, we are the co-chairs of the Racial Justice Committee here at Kenilworth Union Church. And before I turn this over to Robin Roberts, who's going to lead the program tonight, I wanted to say thank you to several important people from Laura and me. Laura and I went on this trip. We'd like to start by thanking Bill and Kathy for your great support and participation. This trip wouldn't have happened without the two of you. Also like to thank Diane Rand. Diane, could you raise your hand or something? So Diane has been on the Racial Justice Committee since we started, just as Bill has been for about 2.5 years ago, and she raised her hand to help with this trip. Well, a trip like this, size of a trip like this involves multiple airplane seats, a bus, local resources in Alabama, and finding a guide who would be an expert on the civil rights movement. And I think you'll get a sense of this tonight, but Diane found all of those. And if you ever need to plan a trip, no. Diane was great, and we all are so grateful for everything that you did, Diane. Also want to thank everyone who's here. Great to see you. Thanks to the people who were on the trip who came out tonight, and thanks to you who didn't come on the trip. We really appreciate your interest and your support, and look forward to sharing what we learned, what we saw. And I'll end here by thanking Robin. Robin agreed to lead the program tonight, and we're grateful for that. And Robin, you're on. Thank you.
Well, I was going to begin this. I don't know how Bill does this. This is like a moment. I was going to begin this by thanking everybody that Dana so wonderfully thanked. I will have to say how Diane got us on a cigar plane. There were 20-ish of us on a cigar plane, taking up 90% of the seats. I mean, she does rock. And this trip rocked. So what we're going to do, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief overview of what we did on the trip and where we went and its significance. Then we're turning it over to everybody in the front row who were the participants, and we're going to go through the slideshow, and everybody has reflections, quotes, thoughts that they're going to read. So this is really all about you guys in the front row. I'm just sort of the glue. So let's get going. We're hoping this takes about half an hour, 40 minutes, depending on what happens. So the introduction is that we started in Selma. That is most famously known for the marches in 1965 over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, as both blacks and whites marched to attain voting rights legislation. Ironically, I don't want to move it yet.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I have a plan.
Okay.
Sorry.
Just wanted to make sure you knew how it worked.
Thank you, John. I'm going to give the overview, and then we're going to go to the slides with the speeches. Edmund Pettus actually was a Confederate brigadier general. He was a U.S. senator, and he was a Grand Dragon of Alabama's KKK. So that gives you a little bit more historical context of the march over that bridge. Then we moved to the capital of Alabama, which was Montgomery. This is where Rosa Parks in 1955 bravely refused to give her seat to a white person, and her conviction led to a bus boycott that lasted well over a year until the U.S. Supreme Court finally ruled that there would be no segregation allowed on city buses. It's also the place where, to give again context, in 1963, as new governor of Alabama, George Wallace said, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever." So you have two very different philosophies. In Montgomery, we also learned about the Equal Justice Institute, whose mission in part states, EJI is committing to ending mass incarceration and excessive punishment in the U.S., to challenging racial and economic injustice, and to protecting basic human rights for the most vulnerable people in the American society. It was founded in 1989 by Brian Stevenson, who is a widely acclaimed public interest lawyer and best-selling author of Just Mercy, also a movie, well worth watching. They work with communities that have been marginalized, but most importantly, they are committed to changing the narrative about race in America. To that end, changing the narrative, they have two amazing museums. The first one is called the Legacy Museum, and it provides a history of Black people from enslavement to mass incarceration. We have no photos from that visit. We're not allowed to take them, but we have a lot to share. One quote on that wall said that to have accountability regarding our history would completely change the Black experience in America. I don't know about you, but I sort of thought this whole racial journey was for only restitution or other things, but what really I learned is just owning it. Let's just own it. Let's start there. That's a really positive step. Then we went to the National Museum for Peace and Justice, which was nicknamed the Lynching Museum. We do have pictures from there. EJI is committed to documenting each death known as a lynching, but lynching can cover any kind of death, and honoring their victims. So far, they are at 4,000 and counting. These happened between the end of the Civil War well into the 1940s. Finally, we went to Birmingham, where we visited another museum showing how separate was never equal. And again, in 1963, the Ku Klux Klan bombed the 16th Avenue Baptist Church, killing 4 girls. And in each city, we visited churches. The churches were often the homes of the civil rights movement because it was the only place where large groups of Blacks could gather and pray and have discussions, and where leaders such as Martin Luther King, John Lewis, Thomas Gray, and many others organized. It's hard to put in words what happened to each of us on this journey, for it wasn't a trip, it was really a journey. And for many of us, that journey has just begun. It is far from end. So we're going to now go to the slideshow, and we'll see how this comes together. So we're going to start in Selma. Peggy? Yes, you need a bike.
He'll turn it on when you start speaking.
Hey, Peggy, let's try this one.
Thank you. Oh, I think it's just on. Hello? Okay. The Civil Rights Tour was not a political exercise. It was a personal journey. For 3 days, I was immersed in a narrative about the history of the African American experience. At Montgomery's Legacy Museum, I was able to envision what it was like to be stolen from home, stripped and packed like cargo onto a ship, and taken across the Atlantic. In Montgomery's Court Square, I could imagine the indignity of being publicly inspected and sold like cattle to the highest bidder. I cringed when confronted by slavery's inherent brutality, whipping, rape, and lynching. At the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, I considered the humiliation of segregation and the sneering disdain for African Americans, whether they were trying to register to vote or simply board a bus. And I began to wonder at African American resilience. How have they kept hope alive? How could they not be bitter or angry about this legacy? It became clear to me why a person with black skin does not experience life in the United States as I do.
The next one is Becky and Lester.
I see the world with rose-colored glasses because I have been able to. The sites we went to on the trip to Selma, Birmingham, and Montgomery, Alabama, factually and historically walked us through the timeline of slavery and its many, many aftermaths: Reconstruction, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, and the ability of state and local governments to circumvent federal laws and mandates in order to continue. We looked at how our history in this country has directly and specifically impacted the condition of black peoples with regard to poverty and resources today, and we saw how white people everywhere benefited. It was not just the South that were the perpetrators. Everyone benefited from slavery except the slaves. Our guide, Barry, told us, that this all started in the 1600s, not just the 1800s. Caribbean slaves worked the sugar crop. Christopher Columbus brought gold back to Europe and made the indigenous peoples there mine. If they didn't gather the prescribed amount, he cut off noses, ears, and hands as a warning. Columbus was revered to me and to Lester in grade school. Lynching was a strategy of terrorism. It was a deterrent. It kept order. Physically seeing the names and counties and the sheer numbers of lynchings, it was done in public, in the daylight, sometimes after church. It was a public spectacle. Those who perpetrated the lynchings were known in the community. No one was punished. Thousands observed. Children were present. There was no due process. We saw how lynching served as a form of indoctrination. Again from Barry, a child's psyche, a Caucasian child's psyche, had a choice: be deeply frightened and terrorized by what your parents and authorities are doing, or accept their logic that black people were inferior and bad. I asked Barry why, if you saw your slaves as animals and economic assets, so why would you hang them? You wouldn't lynch your cow, would you? It's an expensive item. Barry said, you would, if in hanging one, it would scare all the cattle into staying in the pen. That was chilling, and it was strategic. I like to think this all happened in those southern states down there. It happened everywhere. Illinois, in East St. Louis, there was a massacre. I grew up in St. Louis. Southern Missouri, where I have relatives, people were shot, burned, alive, dismembered, fingers sold as souvenirs, and found later in Bibles. It wasn't just the 1860s, it was the 1900s. My father was living when lynchings were happening. I wondered where the churches were. I make applications to myself in these things I'm seeing, and I asked myself, what do I not want to see now? What am I whitewashing and don't want to see? Where am I turning away when people are suffering?
Those were the two best introductions. They're a little bit longer. We're going to start picking up the pace and start with voting rights. And the first we're going to hear from Lynn and Cam.
The voting rights movement was based on nonviolent protests. It required great bravery on the part of participants who knew they could be jailed or worse. Music gave them courage and provided solidarity.
Peggy?
What do jelly beans and ivory soap have to do with voting? Nothing if you're white, everything if you're black. In our lifetime, the majority of black Americans in the South were prevented from registering to vote by a series of complex literacy tests that were not administered to white registrants. Questions on this test were demeaning and mocking, including how many jelly beans are in the jar in front of you, how many bubbles in this bar of soap, and how many seeds in a watermelon. Poll taxes, intimidation, and violence were also used to prevent African Americans from voting in the South. At the Selma Interpretive Institute across from Pettus Bridge, I learned that from May 1962 to August 1964, only 12% of Southern blacks who applied to vote were approved in Dallas County, while 77% of white applicants were approved during that time. But these numbers belie the political impact of restricting a block of citizens from their fundamental right to vote, much less the personal anguish of African Americans who were denied the most powerful tool we have as Americans.
And as we're thinking about voting rights, two additional things. Over somewhere on that table, I have a sheet when you leave asking you questions, and you had 3 minutes. That's it. You have 3 minutes to answer everything correctly. I administered it to my brother, who said, damn, I got the jelly beans right, but I missed the watermelon seeds by 3, so I guess I've got to study harder. And the second thing, remember, where do you pull a jury? From the voting polls. If you don't have African Americans on the voting polls, they aren't serving on the jury. Okay, so now we go to voting rights in Selma and the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Heather?
Right here. Walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, we could feel how the rounded shape of the bridge made it impossible for the marchers to see their future attackers. if you look there, you can see you can't see what's over on the other side. So they couldn't see them until they reached the top and came upon them. I was struck by the determination and incredible risks they were taking while fighting for basic rights, the right to vote.
From Leicester, as we walked across the bridge, I could picture all the troopers waiting at the other end. It would have been a very scary moment, trapped high above the water, knowing violence was coming, hatred hovering.
And Martin Luther King picked this particular site to do a march for voting rights because the sheriff was incredibly violent and they had news coverage. So as they walked over this bridge, and the first time they did it, it was called Bloody Sunday, John Lewis was in the front. He was quite young, and they knew they were going to get the living daylights beat out of him. So now we're going to go to the church that is by the Edmund Pettus Bridge where they organized. I'm going to show you 2 slides. Turn around, and that's the housing behind. So let's start with Becky and Lester again.
From Leicester, the church right across the street from the housing projects for black people. It was like a powder keg waiting to blow up.
Laura is going to read Jennifer's.
It's from Jennifer Lind. Especially awful that KKK members put door hangers, flyers with threatening messages on the doors of Selma's black community in 2015 when then President Obama visited and walked across the bridge to commemorate the 50th anniversary with Representative John Lewis.
Lindy, you have Jean's comment?
I'm speaking for Jean. Black churches were and are an important part of African American culture in the United States, and an exhibit in the Civil Rights Museum illuminated that for me. Our wonderful guide, Barry, explained that black churches were the only place where African Americans could safely gather and express themselves, unless they were being bombed. Whereas during their daily lives, the church members were called boy or gal. At church, they were brother, sister, deacon, deaconess, reverend. In their churches, the ministers could freely talk about the challenges facing their black congregation and therefore became important leaders in the civil rights movement. Alleluia.
We're going to the Tabernacle Baptist Church, also called the Church of Two Faces. And Kathy?
Having spent a good portion of my life in churches, I still love to visit and go into churches while traveling. While standing outside of Tabernacle Baptist Church, it was such serendipity to meet Gwen, one of the church trustees, who unlocked the doors and gave us a private tour. You could see her love and enthusiasm for the church's mission now and in its past. The black church architect who designed the building, he designed the building with 2 formidable entrances, one on Minter Avenue and one on Broad Street. At the time, blacks were not allowed to walk on the busy Broad Street. Members entered on Minter Avenue. But I love the statement the architect made. Maybe he was just thinking, just you wait. The church changed its address from Minter Avenue to Broad Street after the reversal of the Jim Crow laws. Seeing the sanctuary, you can envision the first mass meeting of the voting rights movement in May of 1963. Those sanctuary walls seemed to ring with passion and determination.
Just so you know, this is the original entrance on Broad Street. And after the church was built, they put in place a rule in the city that nobody could enter churches that were on streets. So that's why the second entrance was on an avenue. So they were determined. There were also instances, we were in a bunch of churches, where a church would be built and the city would arbitrarily condemn them and they'd have to tear it down. And so they would start over. Okay, Heather.
I also was struck at this particular site by the myriad of rules or roadblocks, many of which were nonsensical, like that one, where you can see where they have 2 separate entrances. And by these roadblocks were thrown up in the face of black people to keep them down. But they had incredible determination to find a way forward. One example of this was the Tabernacle Baptist Church, the Church of Two Faces. They were told that they were not allowed to have the church with an entrance on the street, so they built the extra entrance, literally as a way around a nonsensical rule.
Laura, do you want to read Jennifer's?
Sure. I learned about the African American religious community's forgiveness and perseverance, details of the role community churches played in the civil rights movement. I had no idea.
Then we moved on to Montgomery. And we're going to start, and this is a little bit of an illogical picture, because our first museum, as you may recall, was at the Legacy Museum, and we have no photos. So I just put that up there because the Legacy Museum is by Brian Stevenson, and that's one of his quotes. What's behind is actually the National Peace
Memorial for Peace and Justice.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for saving me. So let's go, and we're going to have reflections of walking through the Legacy Museum, so that's a fake photo. Let's start with Lynn and Cam.
This is a quote from an article in the New York. Is this working?
Yep.
This is a quote from the article in the New York Times on April 25th, 2018, about the opening of the museum, and I thought it was worth sharing. Quote, "It is not a conventional museum. It is perhaps better described as the presentation of an argument, supported by first-hand accounts and contemporary documents, that the slavery system did not end, but evolved. From the family-shattering domestic slave trade, to the decades of lynching terror, to the suffocating segregation of Jim Crow, to the age of incarceration in which we now live." End of quote. Sadly, the beat goes on.
Caroline?
I didn't fully understand before the trip the scale and length of the slave trade, the impact in the U.S. to the end of the trans-African trade, and Americans' obsession with, addiction to, and dependence on free labor. It is too much to even try to convey and summarize when we thought we arrived well-read and focused. I also learned that slavery is still active behind the curtain of mass incarceration, today known as convict leasing.
Becky and Lester? I don't know whose comment is whose.
I'm not sure that we understood the scope that slavery had on how the U.S. built wealth from agriculture based on free labor, and how it put the United States on a world stage, helped make it the power it is today. Slavery was a system and an economic engine, building an industry that made people wealthy, and it was an economic engine which brought us power even now. I've been to 2 Nazi concentration camps. I've wondered about and sometimes judged a country who could murder 6 million Jews so strategically. Somehow, in school, the scope of murder and enslavement of black people in this country got glossed over, literally whitewashed. I left our trip more clear-eyed than ever before that we, the U.S., we've killed like that too. And we don't like to acknowledge that we did it, and we don't want to see our legacy. It was uncomfortable. I can see why we as a country would rather skip over this enormous part of our history. So many times when we were there, I wanted to look away, but I thought to myself, if they can live through it, I can just look at it.
I also felt very overwhelmed when I first entered the Legacy Museum in Montgomery. When I walked through the initial exhibit, where there are many busts sculptured by the artist Kwame Akoto Bamfo, positioned with video footage of the rough ocean flowing behind them, I began my own important journey into this museum and all it has to teach us.
Linda?
Thank you. As Caroline said, I think we all arrived feeling that we were pretty well educated and well read, but we learned a lot. Never has the thread been pulled through so clearly as at the Legacy Museum, and the way they brought it all together through art, facts, and stories just blew my mind. I think about it every day and look forward to returning with my family. I believe every student in the U.S. should somehow have to experience the Legacy Museum to come to terms with America's original sin and the continuing racism in our society today. Just like German students are required to visit a concentration camp before graduating, we should think about the same thing for students here. I wish there was a way to export the learnings and capture the impact of the museum across our nation.
One other thing to share, and it's opening argument. So you literally walked in and there were these, it started with the 1600s and the slave trade. There was an opening argument. A lot of it was audio, a lot of it was news clips from original footage, etc. But its opening argument was that they chose to use the word kidnapped people from Africa. And that hit me. We all had our own different aha moments. Somehow, I've spent 60 some years on this earth thinking that people were enslaved. It was a very passive word. Like it didn't quite hit me the way the word kidnapped millions of people did. That was just an example of the kinds of learnings that you got walking through the Legacy Museum. Now we're going to go to the actual lynching museum. Heather?
Okay. So at the lynching museum, the vast number of the lynchings and the sheer horror of them were incredibly overwhelming. Lynchings is a term used for all killings: hanging, burning, mutilating, shooting. The fact that they were spectacles like a fair where white people would bring their children to watch and sell postcards and popcorn and make an outing of watching another human being be lynched. Aside from the incomprehensible act of doing this to another human being, they were telling their children that this was acceptable. As a teacher of young children, I know that this must have been terrifying for these children.
Just a moment. This is the same artist that had beautiful hundreds of heads at the very beginning of the Legacy Museum. He's a fantastic artist. And Heather, you're the only one I know who can perfectly pronounce his name, so thank you. Lynn and Cam?
The National Memorial for Peace and Justice displays hundreds of huge hanging columns, steel columns. You can see them here in this picture. They're really massive. There's a separate one for every county in which there were lynchings, and on each of them is an inscription of the date of death of somebody who was lynched in that county. As was mentioned before, there have been more than 4,000 lynchings. That exhibit reveals the grim results of a very long campaign of racial terror.
I was struck by the mundane reasons for which you could be lynched and how it was a very public, festive affair. Horrific. And I should have connected the dots, but the Great Migration that happened in response to the terror Black people experienced in the South, I didn't realize that it was in response to terrorism. So many immigrants from repressive governments make the same pilgrimage to the United States. This happened in the United States, and these were Americans fleeing American terrorism.
I apologize, Diane. I clearly cut out a couple of words, so you regrouped well. Mm-hmm. Susan? Oh, no.
I was deeply disturbed to fully understand that both lynchings and the KKK events were not only tolerated, but in many cases public spectacles. They were put in newspapers. Tomorrow we're going to have a lynching. There were postcards sold afterwards. To hear individual stories brought to life at the museum was very powerful.
Just so you know, it's a museum that you walk in on, and the columns are right at face level, so you're reading all of these stories. And as we walked through, you can see the columns, the pathway goes down, and so you end up with having all the columns hanging above you. It's quite powerful. Okay, now we are going to move to the Montgomery slave trade. I think that's Laura and Dana.
Barry said the price of a slave, the price a slave could command was higher if they had been on a plantation in the Caribbean. He compared it to a horse that had already been broken in. When a plantation owner had a 16-year-old son, the custom was to allow them to practice on a slave of their choice. Also, ads for fancy girls were slaves for sex only.
This is where the slave trade happened, on a platform, and Montgomery just put in a lovely fountain, and that was an example, black and white, sorry for the pun, of how so whitewashed some of these sites were. But that was a great court square where these slave sales were happening. Rosa Parks. Is that Lindy?
Yep. I have always admired Rosa Parks. Little did I know her inspiration for the Montgomery bus boycott lasted 382 days. She was tiny in stature and a mighty force. Her strength was an integral part of the inception of the civil rights movement. The 2 pages we learned in 6th grade social studies was the tip of the iceberg. We have so much more to learn. We can make a difference. Shortly after the civil rights movement, Rosa moved to Detroit. At 81, she was assaulted and robbed. Mike Ilitch, the founder of Little Caesars Pizza in Detroit, moved Rosa to a safer apartment and quietly paid her rent for the last decade of her life.
Then this is the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, another church in Montgomery. Was that the home of Martin Luther King when he was living in Montgomery, right? Mm-hmm. And we could not get into that. We went into a lot of churches. We could not get inside that one. Then we moved to Birmingham, Alabama, and we started off at the Civil Rights Institute.
This is Jennifer Lind. The most awful moment came for me came at the Birmingham Museum regarding Emmett Till. More details of his killing surfaced in 2021 that showed how the 4 men who murdered him slowly tortured him while he was hanging in a barn near the Tallahatchie River. The setup in the barn proved that what black people knew to be true for centuries, that white men tortured blacks for their own entertainment. The word chosen at the Legacy Museum was gloried in torturing blacks.
So one of the other things we've learned, we've done a lot about lynchings, which all came out of the sort of the Civil War into the 1940s. But there was a whole movement historically, separate but equal. The U.S. Supreme Court codified that in the late 1800s, that it was okay to not mix and mingle blacks and white as long as blacks had their own place. But what the Civil Rights Institute demonstrated with some of these great exhibits that we were allowed to take pictures of was that separate was never equal. And there's a perfect demonstration of a young black girl looking in because she can't go into that soda pop bar. There's an example of a black classroom versus a white classroom. Even the lighting, Barry was great in pointing out things. I mean, the obvious things are electronics and just a nicer room and books. But he even pointed out the lighting was never as good in black classrooms in all the first half of the 1900s. Here's another one. Is this Heather? Oh, Susan, sorry.
It was just so outrageously unfair how blacks were over 40% of the population in Birmingham, but were only allowed to live in 11% of the city. My aha moment came when I realized how similar this was to perhaps the redlining that has happened up north in the Chicago area. We have a long way to go. I mean, while we don't actually have segregation in Chicago, we still have a lot of remnants from our redlining, and looking at Birmingham, it just really made me aware of how outrageous it was that we had limited blacks to living in such a small area.
Diane?
I somehow don't have this.
So
the KKK robe. Oh, there you go.
I was
Diane.
stopped dead in my tracks at the sight of the KKK robe with the remnants of blood still on it. It literally just took my breath away to imagine the man who wore it and how the blood came to stain it. Also, the cross that accompanied it in the background, it was from 1991.
I had the same response at that very same site. I am standing in front of an actual Ku Klux Klan robe and hood. I had never seen one of these for real, and it was absolutely terrifying. When Barry pointed to the cross included in the exhibit and said that this cross was from 1991, I had to ask him to repeat himself because I couldn't believe it. I felt so overcome and could not stop the tears as I tried to comprehend that people literally put on this outfit with the clear goal of terrorizing other human beings.
And to be clear, not only adults, but in the Legacy Museum, there were photographs of complete family gatherings, and there were size 6 and size 8 KKK robes with kids as young as 6 and 8 in full garb. So then we moved on to another church, the famous 16th Street Baptist Church. Kathy?
Sitting in the sanctuary of the 16th Street Baptist Church, my thoughts are what it must have been like to be inside those walls the day of the bombing. Surely the pastor's wife and her children were there. Her husband had his sermon written and ready to deliver, a typical Sunday until. The image of the 4 girls lost that infamous day is illuminated to the left of the pulpit to make sure that no one forgets that day. Seeing the church clock stuck forever at 10:22, the time the bomb went off, and learning that the Sunday school lesson for the day was a love that forgives will always remain in my soul. Who can hate so much to do such a horrible thing? It all reminded me once again of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote, "Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that."
I was touched by the churches we visited. The impact of the 16th Street Baptist Church packed an emotional wallop. To sit in the sanctuary and learn of the central role the church played in the civil rights movement in the community, to reflect on the 4 young girls who were killed and the one who almost was, along with the 20 others who were injured, was powerful. And then to imagine Martin Luther King giving the eulogy for those 4 girls in that place.
As we went through, we read a lot, and there were some of our favorite quotes. So we don't have photos to go with that. I may just start going backwards so you can just take another gander at the photos. But we have some favorite quotes, and then we're going to have some closing arguments. So let's start with Caroline.
I just want to preface by saying I heard this quote in a film in the Legacy Museum, and I couldn't help but think that it's relevant today as well. It's all right to tell a man to lift himself up by his own bootstraps, but it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself up by his own bootstraps. Martin Luther King.
I found this quote to be inspiring. It was by Nelson Mandela, who also was a key influence on Martin Luther King. No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite.
Caroline? And then finally, this quote was painted on the side of a building in Montgomery, sort of welcoming you into this historical part of the city. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Maya Angelou.
And then we have 2 sets of closing arguments for you, starting with Lindy.
Faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase. Martin Luther King Jr. Obviously, the pain we experienced in seeing so many aspects of racial injustice while in Alabama was devastating. However, when I asked Barry, our guide, how we could help, he said, "Keep believing, keep hoping, and remember your faith, even when you don't see the whole staircase." I was powerfully moved at the depth of faith I witnessed in Alabama.
Most white Southerners, and perhaps Northerners too, believed that blacks were inferior. They were thought to be stupid and dangerous. Blacks faced discrimination every day of their lives and lived in fear of brutal attacks and even death. Their dignity and courage is inspirational and awe-inspiring. Many carried on with grace and humility. Many resisted, while they also sang. The fallout from this tragic time in America's history continues today, not just in the South. Discrimination is still part of every day for many blacks and other people of color. What do we do with what we have learned?
And that brings us to the conclusion of our presentation. As you can tell, it was an amalgam of everybody's thoughts and experiences. So thank you, everybody who participated. And now if I can find Bill in the room, I'll turn it over to Bill to moderate questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Excellent job pulling this all together. It takes a great editor to make a document flow, and that's what you did, so thank you. I'm just here to moderate some questions and answers. And by the way, this is being streamed, so you will only be heard if you wait for the mic to be brought to you. So maybe, Laura, you can be our mic runner. Kathy, you too. Are there any questions, especially for our participants? Or any other comments from you who went on the trip? Susan.
I'm curious of sort of the processing that you all did together during the trip. It's pre the elections, and there's a lot of conversation about some of the things that you saw happening back in the earlier in the century of people not having access to voting and the diminishing of people and things like that. I was just curious, like, if you process some parallels of what was happening then and what's happening now, and do you have any solutions?
Great question. I'll take the mic, but I'm not going to answer that.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello. Hello.
Maybe because you have the other mic?
So my day job, can you hear me out of this mic? My day job every 4 years or so is to be an election protection attorney. And so for me in particular, given I started in '08, and I've done every election cycle since then, and the consistent discrimination of all people of color, poor white people, people who are underserved is real and alive, and that's why it is so important that we keep on fighting for. They've got a John Lewis voting rights. The Voting Rights Act got just kind of eviscerated. So we need to keep pushing our congressmen and our senators to keep voting rights in the top of mind. So hopefully that answered a piece of that.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. Somebody, I forget who it was from this group, told about the very preliminary, very initial step of just owning our American history, that Americans fled American terrorisms during the Great Migration. And hanging on to that memory today is crucial. You've heard me say from the pulpit before that there's a school district in Tennessee which forbids any books about Ruby Bridges because it's too negative. There's a huge article in this month's Atlantic about the way Germany has managed its own unpleasant history, about how they've made it almost a tourist attraction and an industry to tell Germans what it means to be Germans historically. They've done that so beautifully in Germany on the Holocaust, and we're learning to do that. So I went on the trip and was so glad that amidst all these school districts in Alabama, which are forbidding the reminder to white people that they're descendants of slave owners, that there was this honesty to remember, especially by Brian Stevenson in Montgomery. Yes, Richard.
Did the idea of critical race theory come up at all while you were on that trip?
Do you want to speak to that?
Obliquely, wouldn't you say, Linda? Maybe not by name, right, but it was kind of in the water and in the air we breathed, whether or not. Barry talked about CRT. Barry was our leader in all three cities.
Bill, I'll just add that while Alabama does enjoy a great financial benefit from people doing exactly what we did to go down there and learn the history, that the governor of Alabama has put in restrictions on what people can learn about down there.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you, Dana. Thanks for that reminder.
I don't know the details of it.
We don't want our 8-year-olds feeling bad about themselves. You can't have any white person feeling bad about being white. That's essentially what the governor of Alabama would say. That's not necessary. But to Dana's point, correct me, participants, if I'm wrong, the civil rights tourism industry in these 3 cities is $4 billion a year. We gave them, how much did we give them? $80,000?
And they don't allow the celebration of Martin Luther King Day. That kind of celebration, I think that's what that
Oh, is that true, Lynn?
Just say that again. Yeah. Yeah.
Am I right about that? Yeah. They enjoy all the money coming in, but they are not allowing school children and others to celebrate Martin Luther King Day or honor those triumphs for the blacks.
Scott had a question back here. Oh, David first and then Scott.
So I just want to respond a little bit more to the question over here, which was how did we process it, and did you see similarities between today and 100 years ago, right? And the answer is an emphatic yes. I can't answer your last question, which is what do we do about it? I don't have an answer for that. But 2 observations fit into your question, I think. The first is in Brian Stevenson's museum that we've been talking about, the Legacy Museum. It takes you through the history of the African American experience in North America. That's basically what it does, and it goes through the stages starting in 1619 and the transatlantic trade, and then the domestic trade, and then the period of slavery, and then the post-Civil War, and then the Jim Crow, and all of these. And the last stage that it brings you to is the criminal justice system today and how it manifests a similar kind of discrimination. And it ends with a picture of George Floyd. So this progression of this story definitely draws those comparisons between what's going on today and what happened 100 years ago. The second observation I have is when Martin Luther King, the period from 1955 to 1965 is kind of recognized as the years where we got rid of the Jim Crow laws, the institutional endorsement of racism. And, he finally got the voting rights passed. And so then he went beyond the South and he came up to Chicago. And in 1966, he came up here and had the rally at Soldier Field. And as he experienced Chicago and went to demonstrations in Marquette Park and got a brick in the side of his head, he remarked that I've seen great hatred in the world, but never hatred like I've seen in Chicago. And the point being, you can get rid of all the laws that you want to get rid of, but you can't get rid of discrimination that comes from the heart. And that certainly continues today, just like it did 100 years ago. So.
My wife and I had a chance to go down to Montgomery a couple of years ago and did pretty much the same tour. One of the interesting things, and I don't know if you had a chance to see it, is when you're standing facing the state capitol, they have a plaque where Martin Luther King gave his speech after the walk from Selma. If you walk around to the other side of the State House is the White House for the Confederacy, which is, I don't know if you had a chance to go, where they still have reenactors giving tours of Jefferson Davis's house with a great deal of pride, showing off, this is where the house was. And it's a very interesting dichotomy that you have in this city, something that is, they're trying to, I think, educate people about what happened in two ways, and they take pride is maybe not the right word, but they certainly recognize, I think, through some of the stuff that the museums, the peace and justice movement, what happened, but at the same time they still have this pride about the Confederacy and what those ancestors did. So it's just a very interesting dichotomy.
Thanks, Scott. Becky wants to say something, honey.
I have a question for the younger people in the room. I'm wondering what your textbooks said or what the pictures were. So I'm old, and my textbook pictures were sort of pastoral pictures of a plantation, and then there would be a black woman with a white kerchief on, like probably stirring a cauldron. It all looked friendly and nice. So I'm wondering what you're learning at school and if that's different.
Feels like that one's directed at me. I'm actually in school to become a high school history teacher.
Oh, wow.
And wherever I get hired. I would say generally the trend is not using textbooks anymore, and going to primary source documents, because that's where you're going to get the most authentic and like real depictions of what happens from all perspectives, because like textbooks are always inherently going to be biased, as with primary sources, but part of that is looking at the bias in those sources and the documents themselves. So yeah, the general trend is going away from textbooks generally.
But then you will get to pick what you choose for them to look at.
Yes. Well, yeah, and there's a lot of, there's state standards that I'm like required to teach. And we can sit here and talk about like the state standards in Alabama and Texas, but they're not much better here.
So what would those be?
The state,
what are the standards?
Just like teaching American exceptionalism and a whitewash version of history, like a lot of you all talked about. And there's definitely like acknowledgement of stuff like this, and but it's confined to 1955 to 1965, and isn't going beyond that. Isn't talking about the war on drugs, mass incarceration, isn't going into those kind of things. And it's Black History Month, right? We'll put the stuff up in February, have it up in February, and then we'll take it down when February ends.
A couple things I would add, just listening to the conversation. One is, while we might want to think so much of this is behind us, it truly isn't. Not only from the way that Dave described the way that you finish at the Legacy Museum, but we also were across the street from the Southern Law Poverty Center, which looks like a fortress, and which is under guard 24/7 because of the attacks on them for their work.
Because they keep a Klan watch list.
Yeah, and the idea that Birmingham was thought of as Bombingham is sounds like it's still true, at least where the Southern Poverty Center is in is that Montgomery or Birmingham? Birmingham, yeah. But on the hopeful side, I did come away from the trip struck by the difference that one person can make, and you look at what Brian Stevenson has done and how he has basically made the city of Montgomery come to terms with what it has done.
Good point.
And that there's more that we can do to support his work. Bill was talking about the article in the Atlantic. I heard something, I think, on NPR about the stepping stones. I forget what they're called in Germany. I've seen them in Berlin, where outside the house of where a Jewish person may have lived is a stepping stone that memorializes them. There are a lot of things we could do still like that. And Brian Stevenson's group that goes around and collects dirt from each of the sites where the lynchings happened, on the idea that there's DNA in that soil and we remember it and we revere it, they're not done. There's a lot of places still to go.
Heather wants to say something.
Another thing of hope, I think, is we can talk a lot more about Barry, our tour guide, and he does this where he's educating a lot of people, but he also is an AP high school AP US history teacher. He's the chair of the department in the high school where he teaches, and he also works at the Civil Rights Institute, which was the place we went in Birmingham where we saw, there he is, where we saw things like the Ku Klux Klan robe. I know Laura, Dana, and I sat with him at lunch, and we did, he dealt with a lot of questions. Right? He would like periodically get to eat something. But, that question would come up a lot, like what can we do? And obviously he's very encouraged by groups coming and learning and being genuinely interested. But he also said to just be the people that be the friends, like go and do and be. He said a lot. I remember he said this with us a lot of times. It's not as much white people going into the black neighborhood to just be friends and to try to do that more. So I thought that was an interesting statement that he had made.
Back there.
So as you guys went through these cities and towns and going about your day, did you have a lot of interaction with the local people, the local white people, and what was their general commentary, interaction, disdain?
Right.
Gene did.
Yeah.
He's not here.
Yeah. The bus would be ready to leave. We'd have to go get her.
Here,
'Cause she
use
was
the
on-
mic. Use the mic so they can hear you on this live stream.
I brought a lifelong friend with me, and she's really, really friendly. And she would almost miss the bus for being out talking to people. And I caught her hugging someone. She was late for the third time, and she had her arms around this woman, and they were both crying. So I think there was opportunity. We stopped to see the slave market and the Rosa Parks statue, and there were people there that she was so interested. We were looking at her license plate, and all the Alabama license plates say the Heart of Dixie. Yeah. Yeah.
You can see the license.
Yeah, and so she wanted to know why we were so fascinated with her license plate. Yeah. Yeah. And from what I saw, they were the black people that we spoke to were very proud of what they'd done, and I think proud of how far they've come, and that we're there and that we're appreciating, these museums and this history. And no, we didn't get to do as much as we'd like to have, but we did some.
Just a quick adding of the Church of Two Faces. There happened to be somebody that was part of the church that invited 24 people in.
I don't know. I would have invited 24 white people in my
Well, and who knows what she had on her agenda, so she stopped her day to warmly welcome us and tell us about her church.
Thank you, Laura.
My husband got really tired. I think he was overwhelmed, and he said, I'm going to sit down for a minute at the lynching museum. And these two young guys who worked there were standing near him, and so they were chatting. And he said to them, doesn't it bum you out to work here and see these names on these metal things hanging? Isn't this depressing? And they said, no, we find it really hopeful because you're here. And people come through and they see it, and you see their eyes opening. They starting to understand the scope of this.
Fritz.
This has been very powerful, and the insights and thoughts that you've expressed are very affecting. My perspective is in part based on having spent a year in Montgomery, Alabama, working for a federal judge. After law school, I was the law clerk for a federal judge. As Dana knows, the federal judiciary is formed through a district court system and then an appellate court system and then the Supreme Court. The appellate court system is designed to have courts of appeal that covered groups of states. And the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the court that I was working for, and the judge that I was working for was on that, covered at that time Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. So we're talking deep south. And at that point in time, the federal judiciary in many of those states was largely running the prison system, the mental health system, school systems, a whole collection of governmental functions and institutions were under the oversight of federal judges. And these federal judges were largely, indeed as far as I could remember, exclusively from the South. And these men, at that point in time, I think virtually all of them were men, were subjected to a lot of risk and antagonism in their communities. And these are Southerners that were doing a great job, in my view, given the milieu they were in, of enforcing federal equal protection laws, due process laws, and the like, to bring a greater level, by no means perfect, but a greater level of justice. And so as we talk about Southerners and they this and they that, I think it's really important to keep in mind that there are different people in that group of Southerners, some of whom were courageous and very, very effective at bringing the South to a much more understanding, compassionate, just society.
Thank you, Fritz. That might be a good place to end. It's 8:03 on my clock. So all of us are here. And Kathy, you have some refreshments over there, please.
I was just going to say one thing. When you go on the trip like this, you come home and it's, people don't know exactly what you did or where you've been. And you're like, did you have a good time? And you're like, nah, I don't know. It was just super impactful and meaningful and life-changing. But that said, we did have a good time too.
Yeah.
I mean, we had Barry as our leader, but we also had Joy, and she was our food leader. And so we ate very well. We had Barbie who brought in the Joy is a foodie person down there who leads food tours of the South, and we had her for 3 days too. So we had barbecue brought in one night to our hotel. We had chicken and waffles, fried chicken and waffles at Yo Mama's Cafe, which was amazing. And she found us great restaurants and that kind of thing. So anyway, let me get something out of the oven. I'm over here.
Well, I don't need this, but while she's doing that, a lot of you can learn things in the field that you can't learn in the classroom, right? And you can form relationships with people on a trip in this cigar tube airplane that you can't in a classroom. And so a lot of people have asked me, will we do this again? And so the question is always, well, how are we going to be able to scare up 24 people to do this again in the near future? I don't know the answer to that, but the gossip is maybe we should go to Washington, D.C. to see the Civil Rights Museum and the U.S. Holocaust Museum or something. So if maybe there's some interest in our congregation to do another road trip and learn our own American history. Interesting.
I think we have some things, to your point, Fritz, about, like I said, those Southerners. We have some things in this city to look at.
Yeah. Yeah, people have mentioned the Holocaust Museum in Skokie, for instance.
There's a wonderful Brownsville tour, too.
Yes. Did you hear that? Say that again,
I
Diane.
said there's a really wonderful Brownsville tour, too.
Yeah. So let me close this. I'll close us in prayer and dismiss us over there, okay? So let me pray. God, thank you for bringing us together tonight, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to accompany these beautiful people and a tour of our American history. We pray that we who have traveled there will be different from what we were before, and that all of us will make this a priority in our lives to learn where we've been and where we might be able to go into the future. In Jesus' name, amen.